Okay, we are live. Hi, everyone who is just entering this webinar. We're going to give it a few minutes for everyone to get settled, and then we will begin. Thanks for your patience. Just going to give it another minute or so for everyone to be able to join. Thanks for your patience. All right, well, then let's get started. Um, First of all, hello, happy Thursday. We're really excited that you've joined us for this webinar on the AGPL open source software license, Truth Social and Open Source Compliance with Heather Meeker, an attorney who's one of the world's leading experts on open source compliance. My name is Andy Drukarev, and I'm on the team here at FOSSA. FOSSA provides technology to help organizations with open source license compliance and vulnerability management. I'll be your host for today's discussion. Before I go over our agenda and introduce Heather, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping points. First, we will have a few minutes at the end for a Q&A, so please feel free to post any questions you have in the question section of your console. Uh, Next, this webinar is being recorded and will be sent out to you after the event. And finally, we at FOSSA will be following up after the webinar with a few additional resources and links and to see if there's anything that we can do that might be able to support your organization. Now let's begin with a look at today's agenda. So, as you see, we will start with an overview of the AGPL license, including some of its more unique provisions related to software deployment. We'll take a look at how the AGPL compares to other members of the GPL family of open source licenses. Then we'll dive into the Truth Social situation. For those unfamiliar with Truth Social, it is a planned social media site of the Trump Media and Technology Group that's been in the news a lot lately, originally because it was allegedly based on an open source social media framework called Mastodon, which is an AGPL licensed open source framework. But there was initially not the compliance with those AGPL requirements. So there have been a few developments since this originally hit the airwaves, and Heather will discuss those a little bit later on. And then finally, we will discuss compliance with the AGPL license, what that looks like. And then, as I mentioned, we will have some time for questions. So now, Heather, I want to turn it over to you. Like I mentioned, we're so excited that you've joined us for this webinar. And if you could just share a little bit about your background.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here today and welcome to everybody. I am a journalist, and in both respects, I focus on open source software, compliance strategy, and really everything having to do with open source. I work at O'Melveny & Myers, a large international law firm, and I'm also a partner at OSS Capital, which is a VC firm that exclusively invests in commercial open source development. Some of you may have heard of my book, Open Source for Business, which is intended to be a guide for lawyers and technologists and business people trying to understand how to use open source in business. And there'll be some information on how to get the book later on free. So that's me. Also say I was a programmer a very long time ago, and all my skills are outdated. But I love software, and I have been interested in it for most of my life.
Awesome. Thank you, Heather. And then with us at FOSSA, I mentioned it briefly in the introduction, but we help a variety of organizations manage risks related to the use of open source. Organizations use our tools to automate processes around license compliance, vulnerability management, and such. So, let's get started with a look at the AGPL. This is an interesting license for a variety of reasons, and Heather, if you might just take it away.
Sure. So a Pharaoh GPL was the first version of it was was written for, I believe, a project called a Pharaoh. Um, the Affero GPL at this point doesn't have much or anything to do with that project anymore, but the name stuck because it had characteristics that we're going to talk about today. Importantly, when GPL 3 was 2007, a an alternate version of it, a Pharaoh GPL, was released as well because they're trying to address a issue that we're going to talk about in a moment. But a Pharaoh GPL 3 came out on the heels of GPL 3. So it was intended as part of that family of licenses. And at that point, the stewardship of the license was taken over by Free Software Foundation. Um, the biggest difference between AGPL, that's a Pharaoh GPL, and open source licenses is the way it treats network deployment. Uh, and when we say network deployment, we mean making the use of software available over a network as opposed to distributing the software. GPL and most open source licenses have requirements that trigger on distribution of software, but a Pharaoh GPL has requirements that can be triggered even in the absence of distribution. And, today we'll call that SaaS or managed services, but it's all really the same from a 50,000-foot view. You're not actually giving people copies of the software, but you're giving them access to run it on computers that you are actually running. Importantly, a Pharaoh GPL, because it's so different from most other open source licenses, there are many companies that will not use it. Companies that have rules of the road for use of open source software, usually a stop, go, caution list or something to that effect, will often put AGPL on the stop list. The main reason being not that they can't comply with it necessarily, but because it has different compliance requirements and triggers from other open source licenses. And so allowing it to be used in the organization can put another layer of compliance on the company. So companies may not want to do that, engage in the expense or difficulty of it, or in the brain damage of it. And so they actually will put a stop list.
One example of that, which some folks might be familiar with, is Google's policy, and you can Google that if you're interested. Of course, it's they have a public website that outlines the specifics. And so now, Heather, I'd love to dive a little bit deeper into this into the specific mechanism of software deployment in the AGPL. And this really, I think, speaks to some of why the AGPL exists in the first place. Because with the original GPL, that there was perhaps a bit of lack of clarity around deployment. Is that something you can speak to?
Yes. So, as I mentioned, most open source licenses have conditions ranging from notices to source code delivery requirements that are triggered by distribution of software. And distribution is actually a right under US copyright law. And So what it means in US copyright law, unhelpfully, but it is one of the enumerated rights of copyright. So if you distribute a copyrightable work, then you need a copyright license to do that, which is how all of open source licensing works. Because you need a copyright license to distribute software, the licensors under open source licenses can impose conditions on that distribution. However, as the world moved to the cloud, software became less and less distributed, or less and less frequently distributed. So if you look at the way the world was in the 1990s when GPL2 was written, most software was on-premises distributed software. But then we started moving into the cloud, and people in the open source world commented, and reasonably so, that the way technology had changed was kind of an end run around all these licenses, because people could use, say, GPL code and not share their source code changes because they hadn't triggered the distribution that was required to impose those conditions. And this was, by the way, at one time kind of referred to as the Google loophole. I don't think that really is all that accurate, but the idea was that Google was using Linux in order to run its search services, and was not share their changes. I think they actually did. But in any case, people were concerned that this was a loophole in open source licensing generally. So the original Affero license had tried to solve this problem. And when GPL3 came around, as I mentioned, there was a part of the open source community that thought this loophole should be closed. And so during the drafting of GPL3, there was a lot of discussion over whether GPL3 would in fact be a license that imposed a short source code sharing requirement, even if the software was being used to provide a managed service or SaaS or hosted service. There was enough division in the community, so it was decided no, GPL3 would not, quote unquote, solve that problem. But an alternative license, the Affero GPL3, was published in order to solve that problem for people who wanted to move to that license. Since that time, Affero GPL had a fairly slow adoption rate. It was, in a certain way, pretty radically different from what had gone before. And so many people were not willing to accept it as part of the generalized open source model, but it was an alternative. And the people who turned to that alternative were mainly in two very different categories. One category was people who believed that the loophole should be closed and all software should be free, and they moved to AGPL, particularly for software that was of the type that would be used to support hosted services. And then there was another category of people who moved to GPL who are very different, and those were the dual licensors. So dual licensing was pioneered by MySQL, and the idea was, here's a software, it's under a strong copyleft license, and if you can't abide by the terms of GPL, you can buy an alternative license from us. And that worked in the beginning for MySQL because MySQL was mainly a distributed product. Over the years, people who were doing dual licensing migrated from GPL to AGPL because it was even scarier than GPL. So you had two very different camps using the license. Even today, it's not an extremely popular license. GPL and LGPL are much more popular, but it does tend to get used for software that is useful to run a managed or hosted service.
And so you touched on some of this, obviously, when we talk about the creation of the GPL and some of how that led to the creation of the AGPL. But I wanted to spend a few moments diving into a few more of the distinctions and differences between members of the GPL family. As we know, this is not a small family. We'll put it that way. There are multiple licenses here, multiple versions of multiple licenses that run the gamut from the weak copyleft LGPL to the strong copyleft GPL and AGPL, as we've discussed. And Heather, I'm wondering if you could break down for us a few of the more notable differences between these licenses.
Sure. So first, let's talk about the differences between or among these three basic licenses and for a moment. So the canonical open source or free software license is GPL. And GPL is a license that's suitable for entire programs because the rules of GPL basically say if you distribute the software, all of the software that you distribute within this program has to be GPL or GPL compatible. You cannot mix and match GPL software and proprietary software in a distributed program. So there's a lot packed into there. The important thing is to understand what a program is. And a program has a moderately technical meaning, which is an executable process. So if you're, say, on your desktop and you're using Microsoft Outlook, that's a program. If you are using Microsoft Word, that's another program. And you can get them to talk to each other, but they are basically different programs running at the same time, multitasking. You have to switch between one and another if you want to use them. That's sort of a basic user understanding of what a program is. Now, LGPL is a license for libraries or pieces of programs. And its technical name is the lesser GPL, but it was originally called the library GPL. And it's kind of easier to remember it that way because you can have a more a library is code that gets used as part of a program for a programming task that might be done in many different programs. So let's say you are using your word processor and you decide to print what you're working on. The code that does the printing is a library because it might work for all of your programs that you're using on your computer, not just the word processor. So if somebody wants to write a good print routine, that would not be a whole program. That would likely be a library. So a library is something that gets used as needed. And there's some other technical details about how they can be integrated. But if you put a library out under GPL, it wouldn't really work very well because that means every program that used the library would also have to be GPL. And by the way, there are people who do that. They are advocating for free software, but most people who put out code that use GPL installer or a strong license. So GPL is for whole programs. LGPL is for parts of programs. AGPL is basically the same as GPL, but with this extra feature about treating network deployment as distribution. So GPL and LGPL have source code delivery requirements of varying scopes depending on that are triggered by distribution of the code. But AGPL can be triggered by in the absence of distribution. By the way, there is no ALGPL, right? It's only GPL or AGPL or LGPL. There's no library AGPL. That's the difference. The difference between GPL and LGPL is about integration with other code. The difference between those two and AGPL is about what triggers source code sharing requirements. And then, by the way, there are also variations of these like GPL plus various exceptions and so forth, which we won't go into here. But GPL, you should think of GPL as kind of the canonical free software library. And by the way, LGPL is kind of like an amendment to GPL3. LGPL3 is an amendment to GPL3. So there's the base document, which is GPL3, and then LGPL3 has some additional permissions that allow you to deploy the code as a library with proprietary applications. The other difference here is version, and the versions are sort of a little bit counterintuitive. So the most popular version of GPL still is version 2, and then it moved to 3.0. LGPL, the most popular version was 2.1, and then it moved to 3.0 when those licenses were released in 2007. And AGPL is also 3.0 for consistency, but I don't think it actually ever had a version 2. I would not stake my life on that. But the original version written by a pharaoh, I believe, was version 1. So you got to get all the versions right. And whether code is going to be compatible with other code and so forth depends a little bit on these versions. Some people release code under GPL2 or any later version, or just GPL3 to pay attention to versions as well as the name of the license.
Got it. In a quick interjection here, I've gotten a few comments that we're having some audio issues. So my sincere apologies for that. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we will be sending out a recording to everyone after. And if there are any audio issues in that recording, the other thing we'll do is we will create a written companion to this. So we'll share that article with you. So we will have you covered. But again, our apologies for any audio issues. Now let's continue. And I think this is where things kind of get into the nitty gritty, really interesting details. There's a section of the AGPL license, section 13. If you look on the right side of your screen, we actually copy and paste verbatim some of the verbiage from that section that deals specifically with remote network interaction. And Heather, I'm wondering if you might be able to walk us through this and kind of share a little bit of the practical applications.
Yeah, so for those of you who are comfortable looking at contract language, it's useful to look at the actual language that implements the network copyleft aspects of AGPL, and this is section 13. Other than this section 13, I believe AGPL is entirely identical to GPL 3, with a few modest conforming changes. So the thing that triggers source code sharing requirements under AGPL, there are two triggers that both have to occur. One is you've modified the program, and the other is that you're making it available to people through remotely through a computer network. Exactly the definition of this in part because this license has not had extremely broad adoption. But modifying the program is pretty easy to understand. It's, I think, generally thought to be code changes only, but there's no, specific guidance on that. Other possibilities that people ask about are configuration changes and other kinds of changes that are not code changes. As to what it means to interact with it remotely through a computer network, the general thinking is that it is direct interaction. So for instance, if you've got something that is running sort of at the core infrastructure level, and then you've got an application on top of that, there's a legitimate question whether that is making it available for people to interact with over a network. But it is pretty clear that if you make it available as a SaaS in the conventional use of that term, then you have triggered the source code sharing requirement if you've modified the program. So this is the exact language, and unfortunately, there's not a lot of writing and no case law on exactly what this means, but I've just articulated what I think are the general thoughts about what it means. And then if you trigger that, you have to make a program available in source code form. It has to be corresponding source, so with your changes, from a network server at no charge. In actual practice, what this usually means is that people have to put some kind of dashboard feature or a about box feature or something that gives people the ability to download the software, usually from the same place where they're getting access via the computer network to the software.
Got it. And so this is a very good segue into what's been the source of some significant controversy and probably put AGPL into the national spotlight more than it had been previously. So, as I mentioned during our introduction, Truth Social is a planned social media network of the Trump Media and Technology Group. It has been the source of some controversy because it allegedly used the AGPL licensed Mastodon platform, which is an open source social media network framework. Now, initially, there was controversy because Truth Social did not disclose this use, did not comply with AGPL requirements. In the weeks since, there have been a number of developments. And Heather, I'm wondering if you might be able to walk us through some of these, but also some of the interesting hypotheticals that this case study raises, including, well, Truth Social technically was a planned social media network, not a fully operational one. What does that mean as far as the AGPL application, as well as a hypothetical involving the Mastodon licensing?
And so, by the way, all I know is what I read in the news. And those of you who follow issues like this know that sometimes the news is a little bit short on facts. But doing my best to put together what's happened here without any firsthand knowledge. So basically, the first thing that happened was that the Mastodon project and some others observed that the Truth Social platform appeared to be using Mastodon in order to run its platform. But as you mentioned, the platform hadn't really launched yet. But it was available, at least to some extent. So that's one thing to point out, which is that if a program is in beta, it doesn't matter whether it's alpha or beta or GA or whatever. If you are making it available to anybody, then you have potentially triggered the source code sharing requirements. So the first interesting thing was that the platform hadn't really launched. And yet people in the community were able to tell that the platform was using the Mastodon software. And that is, well, I might use the software, but who's going to be able to tell I'm using it? Well, I'm here to tell you that it is actually way easier for people to tell that you are using software, even behind your firewall, than you might think. So the point there is you can't hide from this stuff by, security by obscurity, right? People are going to be able to figure out that you're using certain software just because of the way your software works. And you should never assume that they won't figure that out easily. Then, the next thing that happened was that Truth Social published some source code. But what they published was the unaltered Mastodon code. And that was an odd thing to do because AGPL doesn't get tripped unless you actually change the code. So there, in a certain way, there was not a world in which that publication required AGPL. Either it wasn't modified and there was no requirement, or it was modified and what they published was not the modified code. So that was probably did not solve the problem, but there has not been complaint about that specifically because I think the people who were complaining about it originally might not have as much visibility into exactly what form of code that the platform was using. Another thing that I would observe about this, if you're an IP lawyer and you're working in the world of IP controversies, it is not normal for people to sort of litigate stuff like this in the press. I mean, what the rules of on when you translate it into legal terms is that Truth Social had violated the license and was engaging in copyright infringement. But all of this took place through like open blog posts and so forth. Apparently there were some direct communications, but in the world of open source, this is where you get things where people will think you have violated license and just publish something about it on Twitter or some blog post or something like that. And so that is not the normal way things work in intellectual property controversy. So you've got not only the legal questions to deal with, but a significant aspect of being shamed or publicly because you have violated a license. So all of these things are really object lessons for people who are using open source code, particularly under AGPL, that they need to figure out how to comply before they actually go launching any kind of version of the product that is available to anybody else outside their organization.
And speaking of compliance with the AGPL, again, another good transition here. But I'm wondering if there are any best practices, Heather, that you can call out, as well as perhaps some of the overlooked elements of compliance, because it does go beyond just the source code disclosure, making that accessible.
Yes, so with GPL and AGPL, one thing to remember is that you have to provide what's called the corresponding source code. And that is not just source code, it includes build instructions. And a lot of people kind of gloss that over, but people who are doing enforcement in this area are very particular about that. And so just posting source code is usually not enough. You have to post some scripts as well. The reason people find that troubling sometimes is that often the build and installation script are not what we would call productized. So they may be sort of done in an artisan way every time when the product is built, and that will not satisfy the requirements of the license. So that's one thing to learn about what you have to provide. The other is how you provide it. So a Faro GPL does not have a lot of details on where or how you provide source code. You have to look at the network, the remote network provision to figure that out. But there are lots of ways to do this in practice. The easiest way, if you've got your average SaaS platform, is probably to have an about link or something on the dashboard or in settings that allows the user to go and download the code directly. Anything else is not going. It is ultimately going to be more difficult. And then you have to make sure that what you're allowing people to download is the actual corresponding source code, and that means that you have to update it when you update the code that you're using to provide the platform. Open source licenses also have requirements about copyright notices. Now, copyright notices are different from license notices. License notices are literally plain text versions of licenses. So for AGPL, it would be just AGPL in plain text form. But if there are copyright notices that go along with the code, you have to retain those. If you're providing source code form, that's not super difficult because those are probably embedded in the source code, and all you have to do is not take them out. But you do have to pay attention to the fact that there is a requirement to pass along copyright notices. So all of this stuff is not terribly intellectually complex, but there's a lot of details to take care of. And unless you have, really good processes internally, you're going to have trouble keeping up, particularly in SaaS platforms where things are changing all the time. You have to figure out how you're going to do updates, and that can be a little bit challenging.
Great. Well, Heather, that concludes the first part of our webinar. Now for some questions, and we actually have a number of very good ones, and I'll get to as many of these as possible. And if we don't get to your question, apologies in advance. But I think that let's start with one. Is a program linking to the AGPL code a modification?
So I would say no, it's not a modification. It's telling that the phrase used was modifications instead of creating derivative works. In open source world, particularly in GPL, the phrase derivative works is very fraught because it has meanings that are candidly not intuitive to most copyright lawyers. But if you're not modifying the AGPL code itself and you're integrating it with something else, I would say that it doesn't trip the requirement to provide source code under AGPL. And if you think about this, um, what the AGPL author is trying to do is to make you share changes with their code. They don't really have the legal authority to make you share changes to other code that you're not distributing. I know that that's like a gloss over a lot of potentially complex law, but I would say the rule good practice is no, just integrating with other code is not a problem. But there's a hidden issue in there. And that is that if you're using code, if you're distributing code, then AGPL is just like GPL. And so when you come across code that is a piece of a program instead of a whole program, and it's under GPL or AGPL, you really need to stop and think about whether that's going to work for you, because it could be in the future that you will decide to distribute your SaaS code. In fact, I will tell you that every client who has ever come to me and said, I'm just using this for SaaS, I'm never going to distribute it, ends up distributing their code. Every single one. And the reason, there are lots of reasons why they do that. They do that because they have a customer who needs a special instance behind their own firewall. They do it because AWS doesn't have a local facility and they have to like store it somewhere else in order to serve it up to a customer. They do it because products get productized. And when somebody says, oh, we have this one customer, but they really need their own instance and it needs to be run in their own secure environment, you do not want to be saying, well, we can't do that because we never thought about this issue in the first place, and we have integrated this code into proprietary programs. So just because AGPL has a more limited definition of what triggers the source code sharing requirements, that includes this modification trigger, that doesn't mean you just sort of abdicate all of your analysis, because it is otherwise under GPL and you will not be able to distribute that code. So, so I would say it's not an issue you have to worry about immediately if you're your own SaaS, but you will have to worry about it eventually. And I always tell clients that if they want to use code under GPL or AGPL and they're relying on their compliance for only using it for SaaS or only not modifying it, that they need to have a plan B, because the day is going to come when they can't comply with those licenses anymore. And they need to figure out what to do about that in advance and not paint themselves into a corner.
Thanks, Heather. We actually had several questions about that. So does seem to be a lot of sort of interest and um, perhaps ambiguity around those terms in the license as far as, just merely linking to an AGPL library, trigger compliance conditions, and so on and so forth. On a slightly different note, we have an interesting question here. AGPL contains a phrase, intimate data communication. What is the legal definition of data intimacy? Course, corresponding source includes interface definition files associated with source files for the work, and the source code for shared libraries and dynamically linked subprograms that the work is specifically designed to require, such as by intimate data communication or control flow between those subprograms and other parts of the work.
So you won't be surprised to learn there's no definition of intimate data communication. That, as far as I can tell, I may not be right about this, but as far as I can tell, that was a phrase that was created by Free Software Foundation to help define the difference between one program and many programs. Like if you look back at GPL2, I think it's maybe a little bit easier to understand, because the 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 variable, you can tell I've started as a programmer, right? The definitional term that was used to describe what is under GPL is the capital P program. And everything else that is in that license is kind of subservient to that notion of what is a program. And Free Software Foundation, when they started, providing lengthy FAQs about GPL and so forth and saying what it means, they started these ideas of intimate data communication. And what they're trying to do is explain to you what is a program versus more than one program. In other words, when you analyze GPL and whether it affects surrounding code that you're going to integrate with it, you have to ask, is this GPL code a program that talks to other programs, or is it part of a larger program? If it's part of a larger program, then all the code has to be GPL. As I said, a program has to be either GPL or not GPL, never the twain shall meet. This notion of intimate data communication, I don't know any significant basis for it in law. There may be something buried somewhere, but I assure you that the reported case law on copyrights does not use terms like that. In fact, it doesn't even really talk about what is one program versus multiple programs, because before the Free Software Foundation came up with this idea about GPL covering the whole program, because copyright covers a whole program, IP lawyers didn't even really think that's how it worked, this GPL analysis. So I hate to cop out, but I would encourage anybody who's thinking about these issues to really think more in terms of what is a program versus many programs. So if you have GPL code and it communicates with other code via a means that is normally used between programs, that's okay if the other code is proprietary. If it is communicating via a means that is usually used within programs, that is not okay to use proprietary code that's put together in that way. And some of you may have heard terms like static linking and dynamic linking. Those are ways that code in programs communicate the same programs. And so that's why people say you can't link to GPL code. It's sort of a shorthand way of saying it. And there are definitely cases when these questions get unclear, particularly when you're in the really low-level infrastructure area of coding. But at the application level, it's, as I mentioned, the thing about Outlook and Word, it's a little easier to understand what a single program is, because the way the computer architecture is designed is that you have a program, you switch to another program, and there are different executable processes going on at the same time. When you get down to things like operating system level or even lower, it can get pretty theoretical. And last thing I'll say on this is that's why the best protocol is to assume that everything that's in Linux kernel space has to be GPL or GPL compatible, and not try to separate them out in creative ways, because that usually actually doesn't work.
Great. So we have time for two more. The first, do you think Google's policy of no AGPL under any circumstances is a reasonable one, and other companies would be better off adopting it?
I think that it's a good baseline rule for most companies. And the reason is that they don't have the expertise to figure out a more nuanced answer. Now, I wouldn't say that's true of Google. I suspect that they have said that as a policy for their own reasons, because they're very, very about this. But for most companies, no AGPL is a good basic rule. And I have to say that because AGPL is not an extremely widely used license, mostly you can avoid using code under AGPL. So that means it's a good rule because you can find a substitute. But an important nuance to this is, what is under AGPL that people want to use? And the answer to that question used to be MongoDB, but MongoDB moved away from AGPL and they created their own license. The killer app for AGPL at the moment is Grafana. And so it's not as useful to ask these questions in a vacuum. It's more useful to say, okay, we're going to come up with a rule but there will always be possible exceptions to the rule, and we have to think about how we're going to react to those exceptions. So yes, I think for most companies, no AGPL is a good rule. I mean, assuming that they're developing proprietary software in the first place. But when a question comes up because someone wants to use some code, then you have to get smarter about how you're going to answer the question. Is it okay to use the code or not? And if you're going to allow it, how are you going to make sure you can comply? Because with AGPL, if someone's a code, all of a sudden there might be source code sharing requirements. And then in the organization, you have to figure out how to trigger that. And most open source compliance review happens when you ingest the code for the first time. There's no trigger when you modify the code. So that's a question of internal processes that can be, pretty difficult to sort out. It's one of the reasons why people say no AGPL code.
One comment here, and then I'll finish with our final question. And my apologies if we didn't get to your question. Unfortunately, we are running up against the end of the webinar. The comment is Grafana, like Heather mentioned, Elasticsearch and others are switching to AGPL. So many of our engineers who've been using those would have to abandon them now if we adopt that policy. And I guess that is another consideration when it comes to this decision.
Yeah, so Elastic is actually dual licensed, including under the Elastic license. And the Elastic license is not an open source license. It's a source available license. But it basically just says don't manage. So actually, a lot of people find that it's proprietary license, but they find it reasonable to comply with because they know what they're going to use the code for. It's actually easier to figure that out than figure out whether they're ever going to modify the code in the future. Grafana is under AGPL, and as I mentioned, that's been the switch that has caused the most questions to be answered lately. But I think it's telling that there are not a lot of other examples. So I still think that no AGPL is a perfectly good rule for most private companies who are developing proprietary software. They just have to be shrewd about when they get a request to handle an exception. And so those companies, Elastic and Grafana, are dual license companies. So if you can't comply with the license, you can go get a commercial license from them. And while that may be, some people might not like having to pay for the license, it's a better situation than people who are releasing code under AGPL and absolutely will not grant you an alternative license because they don't believe that anything else is moral, right? So it's actually easier the problem with money than not solve it at all.
Great. Then our last question, if again, not a situation anyone wants to find themselves in, but if in a hypothetical world you do violate AGPL and get sued, what kind of damages might there be?
Yeah, this is a question whose answer got longer last month, so I'll tell it in the short form. For years and years and years, open source compliance actions have been brought as copyright infringement claims. So they've been brought by the author of the code or the copyright owner, and the damages available were copyright damages. Now, that's not much fun because copyright can be significant. They can be actual damages, disgorgement of profits. There are various measures of damages in copyright law. There's also a possibility for injunction, but so far as I know, there's only ever been one injunction issued because of an open source license, and that was a default judgment. So that kind of hardly counts. So mostly damages, and probably the scariest part of it is disgorgement of profits. There's also the possibility of statutory damages, but for enterprise software, those are kind of like peanuts. Those are more interesting for consumer software or software where you have a whole bunch of copyrightable works instead of just one copyrightable work. So that is the conventional wisdom about it. Now, Software Freedom Conservancy filed a lawsuit recently claiming that enforcement could be done in an entirely different way. as a contract and by anybody who had the right to receive the software. I don't think they'll be successful with that lawsuit because it's very different from everything that went before. And but we'll have to see. But I think still at this point, the biggest issue is copyright infringement damages.
Got it. Well, that is all the time we have for today. Again, can't thank everyone enough for your attendance. Hope you found this discussion to be informative and enjoyable. As far as any additional questions you may have, here is Heather's contact information. Here is FOSSA's contact information. We will make this available to you. We will send you an email so you don't have to scramble to write this down now. I think the final thing, Heather, you have a great book, and I know you alluded to this earlier, that folks can get without breaking the bank. If you might be able to share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so my book, Open Source for Business, if you really want a paper copy, you can buy it on Amazon. I purposely set the price as low as possible so that it's very affordable. It's in trade paperback on Amazon. But if you go to my website, heathermeeker.com, and you go to something called links, you can see how to sign up for my book list. And the book list is an email list where I hardly ever send out emails. So the cost is low. You won't get spammed. But you can get the information when you sign up for that list about how to download a free copy of the book, and you're welcome to it. And feel free to share that with your colleagues and so forth. My only concern about the free copies is I don't want to see them on the BitTorrent type sites, but otherwise I'm happy to have anybody sign up and get a copy of the book.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Heather, for your time. This has been wonderful. Like I mentioned, we really appreciate everyone's attendance. We'll be in touch with a few more resources in the days ahead, and have a great Thursday, great rest of the week, and great holiday season.
Thanks very much.